Hey everyone, so today we're going to talk about how the position and the interaction between the ribcage, scapula and humerus can influence shoulder range of motion. And we're going to talk about how we can use this information to guide our rehabilitation for people experiencing shoulder pain or movement limitations at the shoulder. So the first interaction we're going to look at is the interaction between the ribcage and the scapula. So working proximally, and then we're going to move distally into the humerus to see how this interaction between the ribcage and scapula influences the movement capacity of the humerus. So we're going to look at the sagittal plane behavior of the ribcage, flexion, extension, and how that has an influence on the transverse plane rotational behavior of the scapula. So when the ribcage flexes, that will naturally guide the scapula into more of a internally rotated and protracted position where the glenoid cavity faces more forward. And as the ribcage extends, that will naturally guide the scapula back into more of a retracted position and an externally rotated position where the glenoid cavity faces laterally. And that interaction between the ribcage and scapula will have a big influence on how our humerus moves in the sagittal plane and in the frontal plane. So if we're looking at the sagittal plane motion of the humerus and we're looking at humeral flexion, so we ask the client to flex their humerus, we want to see if that humerus can maintain its capacity to stay in the sagittal plane, not deviate out into the scapular plane or deviate across into horizontal adduction, okay? When they move that humerus through flexion, and if we want that humerus to stay in the sagittal plane, we need that scapula to couple in the same direction where it internally rotates to point the glenoid cavity forward to facilitate the maintenance of that humerus in the sagittal plane, okay? And you can try this in your own body. So if you flex your rib cage and just allow your arms to naturally relax and you bring your humerus through flexion in the sagittal plane, you'll feel as though you can get above 90 degrees fairly easily, okay? Now if you extend your rib cage and pin your shoulder blades back into external rotation retraction and keep them pinned there and then try and bring your humerus through flexion in the sagittal plane, if you're being honest with the scapular position, you're going to find that again you can't reach 90 degrees of humeral flexion very easily, because in that scenario the glenoid cavity is facing more laterally. Okay, so the scapula is biasing more of an externally rotated position and a retracted position, and the scapular behavior isn't facilitating the maintenance of that humerus in the sagittal plane as it flexes. So why this is important is because during the early to middle phases of humeral flexion, we want the ribcage to have the capacity to flex and the scapula to have the capacity to protract and internally rotate. But in the later phases of humeral flexion, we do want the ribcage to have the capacity to extend and the scapula to have the capacity to externally rotate to get through full humeral flexion. But it's the early to middle phases that we're looking at first. So we want to see, does the client have the capacity to flex the ribcage, to internally rotate and protract the scapula to facilitate the maintenance of the humerus in the sagittal plane during humeral flexion. Now, if we compare humeral flexion to humeral abduction, it requires a different ribcage and scapular interaction to facilitate that humeral abduction in the frontal plane. So when we're abducting the humerus, we want the ribcage and the scapula to bias a different behavior. We want the ribcage to bias a little bit more of an extended behavior to facilitate the scapula biasing more of external rotation behavior. So the glenoid cavity faces laterally into the frontal plane. So if you try this, if you try to flex your ribcage and allow your scapula to internally rotate and then take your humerus and try to abduct it and keep it in the frontal plane, you're going to find that it's quite difficult to get above 90 degrees. In order to get above 90 degrees, we need to be able to extend and allow that scapula to bias more external rotation. And then you're going to feel as though you can bring that humerus much farther into abduction. Okay, so a big difference in behavior here is looking at the differences in ribcage scapular interactions during humeral flexion and humeral abduction. So it's very important to consider the specific limitations that the client is expressing. So if they're limited in flexion or limited in abduction, you have a good idea as to what kind of behavior the ribcage and scapula need to express to facilitate those movement directions. So you can hopefully appreciate now how important it is to consider intersegmental behaviors to facilitate movement. And this is really the basis of a dynamic systems approach that integrates the interaction between the nervous system and the anatomy, but also appreciates the interaction between the multiple segments of our anatomy to distribute and share motion over multiple segments as we move, because this allows for a much more robust movement system.